really excited as a crops team to be bringing you the strategic farming meeting series as a webinar format. And these webinars are 1 hour in length, and they're going to be taking place throughout the winter season here. We started back on December 19th. We had our first session with Dan Kaiser and Brad Carlson. They talked a little bit about fertility management. That session has been recorded. The webinar session has been recorded and it's up, posted to the web. So if you didn't have that opportunity to tune into that webinar, you can go and watch that at your convenience. Today's webinar, we've got with us Bob Koch, soybean entomologist, and Seth Naeve, soybean agronomist. Technical support and communications, we got Phyllis Bongard, and then myself, Ryan Miller, will be moderating. I do want to make mention here with the format, we've got about an hour allotted. We may go a little bit longer if we get a lot of good question and answer going. And so if you have to leave at the end of an hour, you can come back and find the recording and watch the remainder of what takes place. But we're going to try to fit in an hour here. With that, I do want to mention our next webinar coming up is January 29th, and we'll be tackling cover crops on that one. And so that's something to stay tuned into. And today's title for the webinar was Soybean Management 2020 and Beyond. It sounds kind of like a broad topic, but we've taken the fertility component out, and that took place back in December. And all of our weed management subject matter will be covered on February 27th in another webinar. And so, so that's going to allow us to kind of focus down. Bob is going to talk more about, it's a sporadic pest for a soybean aphid, but it's more frequent sporadic pest. We're dealing with it quite often. We're going to find them in fields probably typically every year to some level. And so Bob's going to address that topic. And then we're going to move over to Seth, and he's going to drill down on a study that took place here and wrapped up a year or two ago. The paper came out, I think. And he's going to be also on hand to answer any other agronomic sort of questions that might come up related to soybean management. And so with that, what I want to call your attention to is that at the bottom of the screen, if you scroll your cursor down, there's a Q&A button. It's an icon on the bottom of your webinar screen. If you click that, you can type in a question to us. We'll be notified that there's a question, and then we'll try to break in and start answering those. So if you do have questions as we go along, please feel free to type them in, and if it's appropriate, we'll break in and answer the questions as we're moving along. Otherwise, the format will be kind of a shorter presentation followed by some question and answer discussion session at the end of that. So with that, we're going to let Bob take over and start sharing his screen. And also, folks, if you've got, if you do have any issues with the communications technology, feel free to hit that chat button. It's also on that bottom toolbar. Send us a message on the chat, and we'll try to get some help out to you. So go ahead, Bob.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. So as Ryan mentioned, we're going to touch on soybean aphid, but we're going to do so in the context of talking about the neonicotinoid seed treatments. So we're going to start out, I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview of what are these insecticides, how are they being used, why are they being used, you know, for what kind of pest situations does it make sense, and then we'll talk about soybean aphid and some multi-state data that we have suggesting that, well, it may not be the best management tactic for that particular pest, and then Seth will step in and talk about another study that he was involved with, multi-state, multiple years, looking at the neonicotinoid seed treatments as well. So to get started, the neonicotinoids are a group 4 insecticide, and what these do is they attack the insect nervous system, much like many of the other insecticides that we use. You know, a lot of them attack the nervous system, but this group in particular attacks what we call the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. And what that really means is they interfere with the chemical communication between two different nerve cells. So there's chemical sent from one nerve cell to the next nerve cell, and that chemical conveys the message through our nervous system, and these insecticides, which include the neonicotinoids, but also nicotine, kind of the natural version of it, and some of the other more recent insecticides like the sulfoxamines, which would be sulfoxaflor, which is transformed, and the butanoloids, which would be something like in Sivanto. So kind of a close-up version here of what's going on in that insect nervous system between those cells. What I'm moving the cursor over now would be one nerve cell, say the upstream cell closer to the brain, and you can see it's releasing that chemical message and it's getting picked up by receptors on the downstream cell. So those insecticides are interfering with those receptors so that chemical message can't bind there and it can't send the important messages from the brain to the rest of the body. So that's kind of the deep dive into how this group of insecticides works to kill insects. So let's step back and talk about these in terms of product names that you might be more familiar with. We've got acetamiprid, which is one of the neonicotinoids, and that would be found in a product like Justice as a mixture. And in this table, the products that are in italic font represent the mixtures, and then regular font are products where it's just that one active ingredient. And then as we go down, we've got clothianidin as a seed treatment formulation. You get products like Poncho, and as a foliar formulation, you have Belay, imidacloprid. We've got Gaucho as a seed treatment, and then several different foliar formulations, either with imidacloprid by itself, as in Admire, or in some kind of a mixture like Leverage or the others. And then finally, we've got thiamethoxam also being used on soybean as a seed treatment. You hear of it as Cruiser. As a foliar, it's a mixture called Endigo. There are several other neonicotinoid insecticides that are available but not currently being used in soybean as far as I know. And those are dimetepharon, nitinpyram, and thiacloprid. So why are we using these neonicotinoid insecticides either as seed applied treatments or foliar treatments? I think the first reason is their relatively broad spectrum. They can kill multiple types of pests, and they do so very effectively. On the flip side, they have very low mammalian toxicity, meaning they're fairly safe to mammals, including humans. And that's one of the main reasons that these insecticides were considered reduced risk insecticides earlier on, as opposed to the organophosphates and pyrethroids, which have much higher levels of mammalian toxicity. Another trait of these insecticides is that they move within the plants, and that movement can be considered translaminar, moving from one side of a leaf to the other side of a leaf, or actual movement within a plant, moving upward toward the tip of the plant. That's called acropedal movement. So if it's sprayed lower on the plant, it could potentially move up, or if it's taken up by a seed treatment, those insecticide molecules will move upward in the plant. And a lot of that movement within the plant or from the seed treatment into the plant is due to its high solubility in water. And then the final element here, especially for the seed treatments, is that ease of use. We can buy our bag of seed, and that insecticide is already there, ready to go. So I just want to point out that some of these beneficial characteristics of the seed treatments, especially their high solubility in water and their high toxicity to insecticides, can also lead to some of the risk for undesirable effects or non-target effects that we hear about sometimes in the media. So this high solubility in the water can result in movement of these insecticides into surface waters or groundwaters, and this high toxicity to different insects is part of the concern related to pollinator health, right? If pollinators become exposed to these insecticides, it could certainly be lethal or sublethal to them. So moving on here, these neonicotinoid insecticides are very widely used. The graph on the right-hand side of the screen shows sales data, and we can see by different crops from the mid-1990s into the more recent time, and we see a very rapid increase once we get into the 2000s, especially in corn and soybean. When we think about seed-applied formulations of the neonicotinoids, we know that these are also very widely used. Some of the published data suggests that in corn, the 79 to 100% of the corn acres, depending on what state you're in, could be planted to neonic treated seed. And in soybean, that level is lower, but still fairly high, with estimates from 34 to 44% of the acres being treated with these neonicotinoids. And a little paper out of Iowa suggested that up to 73% of the soybean acres there were planted to insecticide treated seed, and in specific the neonicotinoid treated seed. So if we look at Minnesota in particular here, the Minnesota Department of Agriculture and the United States Department of Agriculture did a survey back in 2017 asking farmers about their seed treatment use for the previous year. So for 2016, and this pie chart summarizes the results that they got from this one particular question. And what we can see on the left-hand side of this pie is that 50% of the growers indicated that they were treating 76% or more of their acres. So, you know, even in Minnesota, we've got pretty high usage of these neonicotinoid seed treatments. And I just want to point out that a couple of years ago, my colleagues and I from across the northern soybean producing states created this extension publication here. This is available online. And what we do with this publication is try to explain where it makes sense to use these insecticidal seed treatments and maybe where it doesn't make sense and why. You know, we recognize that these are, it's a very useful tool in managing certain pests in certain high-risk situations, but we also try to point out that the current use, this widespread use of these insecticidal seed treatments exceeds the actual scale of the pest pressures. And what I want to do now is shift gears a bit and start talking about some of the labeled or targeted pests for these neonicotinoid seed treatments, and just indicate that most of these pests, you know, though they could be devastating if there was an infestation, most of them are problematic only in a minority of fields or portions of fields. And a lot of times for most of these, there are known risk factors, you know, certain things with that field history or production practices that could be increasing the risk for infestation and impacts by these different pests. So the first pest I want to touch on is a seed corn maggot. So these are the larvae of a small fly, and you can see how devastating they can be when they're in there feeding on the seed or the emerging plant. But the risk factors here, you know, where we're most likely to see injury or impact from these pests would be fields where we've got recently incorporated fresh organic matter. So that could be fresh manure or even a green cover crop that's incorporated. It starts decomposing, and then that will draw in the adult flies, which will lay eggs, and those eggs could result in, you know, the infestation by these larvae. But typically most fields are not going to be very highly attractive to this pest. On top of that, there are degree day models that have been worked out, so you can access those online. And what those models can do is help you identify certain times of the year during the planting season when you could plant to avoid higher risk for egg laid by this pest. The next pest is wire worms, and these are the larvae of a kind of beetle called click beetles. You can see them in this picture here, these brown larvae. They've got kind of a harder exoskeleton than most larvae we're familiar with. And again, typically wire worms are not widespread pests, but under certain conditions, the risk is higher. And for this pest, it's especially in situations where a field is planted into a situation where there's been some kind of grass growing for an extended period of time. So that could be pasture, CRP, sod, going in, working up that cover, and then putting soybean or corn into that. It's definitely going to increase the risk for an infestation by this pest. White grubs, kind of a similar situation where, you know, if you've got that undisturbed pasture going for several years, you could get populations of this pest building up, and it could put your soybean at risk if you were to plant into that. And in parts of western Minnesota, there's kind of an interesting scenario playing out with the different species that tends to prefer cottonwood trees and willow trees. And it's been observed before that, sometimes soybean grown near these kinds of trees can have higher risk for infestation by this pest. Bean leaf beetle. So the previous insects all attacked the seed or the very early germinating plants. Bean leaf beetle could be coming out, feeding on soybeans as a seedling or all the way through the vegetative and reproductive growth stages, really. But for the most part, the bean leaf beetle has not been that big of a problem in recent years in Minnesota. I think the biggest concerns would be for soybean that's being grown for food grade soybean or for seed production. And a lot of that's due to the potential for this beetle to transmit bean pod mottle virus, which could reduce the quality of that product. And also there could be certain fields with just a history of infestation based on the surrounding landscape. And then potato leafhopper, these are tiny little green insects that suck the sap out of the plants. And for the most part, they're not much of an issue on many of our soybean varieties, and that's due to the hairiness or pubescence of those leaves that can protect those plants from this pest. But if you have a soybean variety with little or no pubescence or hairs on the leaves, it could be at higher risk to potato leafhopper infestation. So just to kind of recap quickly, those first pests that I mentioned, if I can find my cursor here, were mainly attacking those. They were soil pests, so of concern for the seed and that germinating plant just as it's emerging. And we got to keep in mind that, after we plant that seed with that insecticidal seed treatment on it, the protection that it can offer is going to be decreasing over time. So for those seed or seedling pests, a lot of times there are no rescue treatments available because those pests are in the soil. So if there is a high risk for infestation by one of those pests based on some of those conditions that I explained, it might make sense to use an insecticidal seed treatment. As we get a little farther into the season, remember that protection from the seed treatment is decreasing. And for a lot of these earlier season pests that might be feeding on those earlier vegetative stages, because that protection is decreasing, some of the other management tactics like scouting and threshold-based foliar insecticide applications could sometimes be a better option. So one of the pests that I didn't touch on yet, but that Ryan mentioned, is the soybean aphid. Soybean aphids are included on the labels for these neonic seed treatments. I think a lot of people may be using the neonic seed treatments with hope that they're going to be getting some impact on soybean aphid populations. But one thing I want to emphasize again is that effectiveness of that seed treatment insecticide within those plants decreases over time. In research, several studies have shown that effectiveness only lasts for 23 to 49 days after planting. And we can kind of see that in this cartoon diagram here, where we've got the plant progressing through the season, getting into later and later growth stages. The red triangle represents the concentration of the insecticide in the plants. So we see that as time progresses, that concentration is decreasing. And a lot of times, soybean aphid isn't coming into the fields really until after that insecticide concentration has decreased to non-effective levels. However, it's important to point out that, certain conditions could increase the chances of getting a return on that seed treatment for soybean aphid management. Those situations could be if you have later planted soybean. Think about a situation, maybe soybeans being planted after peas in southern Minnesota, or which essentially would be pushing the red triangle farther into that purple bell-shaped curve where the aphids are occurring. So you'd actually have higher concentrations when the aphids are appearing on those plants and likely getting some control. The other situation would be if the aphids are colonizing earlier, they could be showing up when that concentration is higher, even though the field was planted at a normal time. And we know there are certain fields across Minnesota, certain areas where fields get infested earlier. Think of smaller fields, sometimes down in the river valleys, surrounded by wooded areas, especially with buckthorn. So there are certain areas where it might make sense to use the insecticide seed treatments for soybean aphid, but I'd say it's certainly not across the number of acres where we're using them now. There's a lot of data published comparing or looking at aphid populations on untreated soybean, seed-treated soybean, and foliar applications. Here's an example that I took from one of my colleagues' recent publications. So Erin Hodson down at Iowa State University from one of her insecticide trials this last year. We see time going across the bottom of that graph. And then we've got the number of aphids per plant on the side of the graph. The solid line represents plants that had no insecticide seed treatment. So reaching up into the thousands of aphids per plant. That dotted line represents aphid counts from plants that had a cruiser thiamethoxam seed treatment. And then the dashed line is soybean that was treated with a foliar insecticide when thresholds were reached or nearly reached. And what we see is, the foliar worked great, suppress those aphid populations. There was some impact of that seed treatment on the aphid populations. In this case, it appears to have delayed that aphid population growth. But if you look at that soybean aphid threshold, 250 aphids per plant, that population still exceeded that level. So in this case, really, if you were trying to manage soybean aphid using that seed treatment, you probably would have had to make 2 treatments for that pest, right? The application on the seed, which would have been a cost, and then that foliar application, because that population exceeded the treatment threshold. Whereas if you were using just the foliar application combined with scouting, you would not have had that seed treatment expense earlier on. And coming in with regular scouting and effective insecticide, you could have knocked that population down and avoided potential yield losses. So, even though we know we get certain situations when we can get impacts of the seed treatments on soybean aphids, a group of my colleagues conducted a multi-state study over 2 years, including several states, Minnesota, both Dakotas, Kansas, Iowa, Indiana, and Wisconsin. And in this study, they aim to compare different management tactics for soybean aphid. The first tactic was reliance on the neonicotinoid seed treatments for managing soybean aphid. And then the second tactic they called an IPM approach, which relied on scouting and then using a threshold-based foliar application of insecticide. So again, applying that insecticide at 250 aphids per plant. And they performed an economic analysis on those data. And here's a quick summary of that economic analysis. So these 2 graphs on the left-hand side are from 2012, where we've got the IPM treatment, which was using scouting in the threshold to determine when to apply the foliar insecticide. On the bottom, that's reliance on the neonicotinoid seed treatment, NST. 2012 was a low aphid year. So we see that for both of these treatments, there was a very low or actual negative return to the farmer because you were incurring those costs, be it for the seed treatment cost or else the scouting cost, and not getting any benefit from it because aphids didn't show up that year. However, in 2013, it was a higher soybean aphid year. Again, on the top, we've got the IPM approach, scouting and use of the threshold, and then on the bottom, the neonicotinoid seed treatment. We see in this case with aphid infestations occurring, they documented higher probabilities of return to the grower for both scenarios, but it was much higher for use of the integrated pest management approach, use of the scouting and the threshold. So with that, I'm gonna wrap it up, and I guess I'll leave it to Ryan to decide if we're gonna address any questions now or if we'll turn it over to Seth.
I think we're going to move to Seth, but if you do have questions, remember to access the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen, type them in, and we can address those as we go, or we can wait to the end. So with that, we're going to kind of switch presenters here for a second here. Seth is going to be sharing his screen, and it's up there, so you're good to go, Seth.
Very good. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Bob. And that was, I think Bob provided a really, really nice overview of the neonics and utility for farmers. I want to talk just a little bit about a very narrow focused area. You know, Bob did a terrific job of identifying IPM-based approaches to using seed treatments, especially, and how those could be utilized to plug into various systems on the farm. What we're going to focus on mostly here is the other side of this equation. So farmers that are utilizing a pure prophylactic approach to using neonics and the potential return on investment for that. So with that, I'll just head into the slides. What we're going to talk about today is based off of a paper that we recently published, and there is an extension publication available, and we'll have a link to that later within this published the published recording of this webinar. But for now, if you'd like to access this, you can go to coolbean.info. That's Sean Connolly's website at University of Wisconsin. And you can find a copy of the extension version of the publication that we published. This was a group of us agronomists got together a couple of years ago, and we're discussing all the research that we generated state by state, and mostly unpublished work that we kind of had in file folders, and determined that one of the first things that we needed to do is aggregate some of this research across a number of us researchers. We included some pathologists and entomologists in 14 states and aggregated this research that's really focused around yield and economic returns of neonics, as well as fungicide seed treatments on our soybeans. So a little bit of background, and I think Bob mostly covered this, but the issue really around using neonics in an IPM strategy is that those strategies get to be pretty limited. As Bob mentioned, we're talking about using neonics for soil-borne insects like wireworms and grubs in the soil. The other obvious one is around bean leaf beetle, where we have food-grade soybeans or those types of soybeans. So the fraction of acres that are covered by those potential scenarios get to be relatively little, or small. So therefore, it's our feeling that the vast majority of soybean seed treatments out there in terms of neonics and the insecticide seed treatments are really used as an insurance-based, under an insurance-based approach, in quotes, to manage our soybeans. So really, this study really uses a large region-wide data set to evaluate the validity of this approach to managing soybeans. Hold on. So the study itself utilized 194 replicated field trials in 14 states. So these were put out from 2006 through 2017. There was more than 11,000 individual plot yield data points to it. And again, these were primarily put out by extension agronomists and soybean agronomists in these various states. Mostly looked at just a pure prophylactic approach to putting out seed treatments on soybeans and monitoring the yields from those. All trials included a fungicide alone, a fungicide plus insecticide, and those were neonicotinoids, of course, as well as an untreated check. So every one of these trials included those three treatments. The study, we're not going to talk about the economic analysis, but we've got a partial economic analysis that has return on investment based on the cost of those products, including seeding rates and the return for the soybean grain. That is included in both the official publication as well as the extension publication if you're interested in looking in more detail. You know, the key to the results, I think, are right here. This basically summarizes the most important bits of this is when we look at all those locations, all those trials, those 194 individual trials. This is the yield results that we see. That the top line represents the untreated control. The next line is the fungicide neonic seed treatment combination, and then fungicide alone on the bottom line. You'll see that we received a significant but very small increase in yield when we had those neonics included with the seed treatment. That gave us a 0.9 bushel yield increase over the untreated control. So less than 1 bushel on average across all those sites for utilizing the neonic plus the fungicide seed treatment. And that was 0.6 of a bushel increased over the fungicide alone. It's interesting to note, or important to note, that the fungicide didn't provide us any yield benefit, significant yield benefit over the untreated control. It was, the mean was only 0.3 of a bushel over. So we had a significant yield increase, but again, it was very small. You can see the confidence interval for this, the 95% confidence intervals are very broad. We're only able to find a significant yield effect simply because we had a very, very large number of observations in this trial. Probably the second most interesting bit of data from this trial was breaking out the individual treatments just a little bit more. If we looked at the individual insecticide treatments, the FT is fungicide plus thiamethoxam. That's the second line. If we have if the third line then is the combination with a gaucho-poncho treatment, and then we have poncho and gaucho individually, and then fungicide alone on the very bottom. Again, the important bit of this is that we see the thiamethoxam provides us a significant yield increase, and that was actually about 2 bushels. So this got a lot of attention in terms of response, that we did get 2 bushels for that cruiser application over the untreated. However, I think it's equally important to note that we did not see any significant yield effect from the other neonics. So there's definitely a separation according to the studies that we examined here, where we did get more of a benefit for thiamethoxam than we got from the other neonics in terms of these results. So yes, it's very possible to see a yield increase of up to 2 bushels. But I think from a practical standpoint, when farmers are being marketed and these seed treatments are sold to them across the winter for their spring planting, I think there's a lot of programs that would provide or indicate that these other seed treatments, other neonics, are just as effective as thiamethoxam. Our data doesn't indicate that. Certainly there are studies that would say that that is true. But our studies indicate that none of those other insecticides really did anything for us at all. So I think the issue here is really that, the last line here in the first bullet is the current default approach to prophylactic applications of these seed treatments really needs to be reevaluated. The issue here is that the response rate is very, very small relative to the cost. Using these things purely in a prophylactic application probably is going to do very little for us in an economic standpoint. The study did look at interactions with a lot of other management, and certainly there's an opportunity, and this is really what a lot of us academics have been looking for. The marketplace really markets seed treatments broadly for every acre, and in terms of prophylactic use is really the preferred method from the industry. Academics understand that there's probably scenarios where these will work better than others. We found some very small but significant increases in some of the activity of these. Narrow rows, for instance, and in more northern environments, we saw very small increases in the chance of positive return on investment for these products. So with that, I'm going to conclude, and I think there should be lots of time for questions for both of us. So I'd be happy to open it up.
So we've got a few questions that came in, and I'm going to start by asking one questioner. They indicated that they have woods around parts of most of their fields, and they use an insecticide. They didn't clarify whether it's a seed-based insecticide or just an insecticide. They go on to say we don't use treatments on our beans, but we do use insecticides. So we're going to ask that person to follow up. Their question then was, is this a good way to control bugs? So maybe what bugs you're talking about, and whether you're talking a foliar insecticide or a seed-based insecticide. So have that person type in a little clarification for us there. We do have another question coming in, and this one is going to probably go to Seth. Have you ever been able to quantify any bigger or increased greenness in emerged V1 soybeans with the use of a neonic seed treatment?
Yeah, that's a good question, Nick. I think there are, certainly we've seen it, and reports in the literature note that, you know, there's quite a few notes to that, and certainly that's what we hear from the industry, that there's a lot of, there's a bigger response. There's a, you know, some people term it as a growth promoter, a plant growth promoter type of a response. My feeling is that if there could be something there, and that may give us a little bit, that may be enough to give us that, you know, that 6/10 or 9/10 in the thiamethoxam treatment. It tends to be more common, I think, in thiamethoxam than some of the others, and so there's some possibility and speculation out there that just that little bit of plant growth regulator might give us a little bit of something early on. It's something we note, but for the most part, when we do note it, we don't see a yield response corresponding to it. So we may, our eye may be more sensitive even than the yield response.
Seth, that reminds me a lot of like some of the responses we see with starter fertilizer on corn. When you put it in furrow and you see this early green up and some more vigorous growth, and then it's real difficult to find those differences in yield data later in the season. So it sounds very similar to that.
Yeah, even a headline response to the fungicide application later in the season, we can see a little bit of a green up. You know, there's you know, soybean is so you know, so flexible in its response to these things that, you know, our eye, I think, tends to be even more finely attuned really than even the yield response to a lot of those things.
Okay, so Bob, back to you. A little clarification on the question about insecticides and bugs. I'm assuming probably the white grubs, you know, an area that you've got a lot more forested margins of the fields. That particular person is putting on insecticide with the planter and looking at some of those early season grubs and things like that, or maybe even bean leaf beetle feeding, and whether there's value in that, or maybe it's just a suggestion on how they might test that concept out.
Yeah, so assuming it's in referring to soil applied
Insecticides with the planter.
Yeah, so for something like bean leaf beetle, I don't think you would get much of an impact, right? Because a bean leaf beetle is going to be coming into that soybean field from some surrounding habitat, and as far as I know, most of those soil applied insecticides aren't going to be very systemic. So you're probably not going to get much protection against things like bean leaf beetle or soybean aphid or other things coming in. You know, I think if you had an infestation of some of those other soil pests, maybe wireworm, white grubs, you know, I think a soil applied insecticide could likely provide control there. I'm racking my brain here trying to remember if I've seen any data comparing seed applied insecticides versus soil applied for some of those pests, and I can't think of any offhand.
Okay, well, and that's a perfect opportunity. We're going to be posting resources online. It'll give us a chance to kind of maybe reach out and figure out if there is something additional to add there. We'll type this question in, and if there's additional information when we get this posted, we'll follow up with that. So we'll leave that one there for today. There is a question coming in here about, have there been trials that include a control using a coated seed treatment with no insecticide in addition to the treatment?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. From this paper that I discussed, the agronomists basically, what we're looking at, comparing our common full packages of treatment. So, for instance, the thiamethoxam with the fungicide was basically a cruiser max treatment. So we would include at that time, however that product was marketed, with the full treatment, including any of the colorings that would come with that. And generally, the untreated control is either completely untreated or treated with water. And so we didn't separate that out for that study, but we wouldn't have added any coloring only or coating only treatments. If anybody did any work on those specific things, they would have separated those out as a separate treatment, and those weren't included in our study. So it's a very good question about how we set these things up, and it's a different way of looking at things. And again, based on our study, because we took a real agronomist approach to it, we only use the products as packaged as they would be sold to farmers, rather than looking at only individual active ingredients without coatings, treatments, etc.
Okay, so follow up, Seth. Do we have any analysis on planting date compared to treatment? So getting at that idea, earlier planted, I'm assuming they didn't type that in there, but
Yep.
if we're getting really aggressive with our planting dates and trying to move them up on the calendar,
we just don't have good data on that. Hold on, I'm gonna excuse myself for 1 second. I'll let you guys finish.
We'll be right back with that one. So we're gonna pause on that question. We're gonna change gears and go back to the entomology side of things here, though. And Bob, I was gonna ask you a little bit about. There's a lot of concern with the pyrethroid resistance in soybean aphid populations. And there's been some concern and some thought that, maybe adding a seed-based insecticide could help, manage that resistance. And so that's one part of the question. And the other part would be this whole, if I'm using a seed-based insecticide, what does that mean for my foliar applications in terms of product choice, so that I'm not, pushing the resistance further to having aphids resistant to more mechanisms.
Yeah. Do you mind if I switch back to my slides?
You can switch back, yeah. Share your screen, that would be helpful.
So let me scroll through here real quick and try to find. Let's just go here quick. So just to point out, or the reminder that, oh, crap. Sorry. I had it. Here we go. So this series of maps here shows where we've received reports of failures of the pyrethroid insecticide. So areas where resistant aphids were affecting the applications of the pyrethroid insecticides. So it is a persistent problem within the state, and it's a problem that's not going away. We have not reports of failures, but laboratory data like this from 2019. These are data from 2018, but where we do the laboratory assays, and in 2019, again, we had resistance documented to the pyrethroid insecticides. So it is indeed a problem in the state, especially considering that we've got so few insecticide groups that we're using for managing soybean aphid. If we're thinking about, will use of the neonicotinoid insecticides provide a benefit for resistance management, insecticide resistance management? I guess I don't think it will. My concern is that all that use of the neonic seed treatments, and if we're thinking about using it for soybean aphid, but a lot of the data is showing we're not getting much of a return on that investment. I think we're getting a lot of exposure of the soybean aphid populations to that group of insecticides, which could potentially drive resistance into that population. That resistance has not been documented yet for soybean aphid, but neonicotinoid resistance has been documented in other pests. So I'd be very concerned if that were to happen in soybean aphid. And one of the reasons I think we should be thinking about our use, or potentially reducing our use of that group of insecticides on the seed, As we think about the rotations, I hope to not make anyone seasick here as I flip through these. This is just a summary of the different insecticide active ingredients that we have available to us for soybean aphid management. And, sorry, overcoming a cold here. We've got a lot of different chemicals listed here, right? So you might think we have a lot of tools, but if you look, these are only coming from mainly 3 insecticide groups. Group 1, which is going to be the carbamates and organophosphates. Group 3, which is the pyrethroids, and that's where we've got resistance. If we look back to the organophosphates, we've got a lot of regulatory concerns related to chlorpyrifos, or something like lorsban, and those regulatory concerns are from the state and federal level. And then group 4 is where we've got the neonicotinoids, the group 4s, and a couple of those newer chemicals. We've got a group 9 insecticide now, but you know, we're pretty limited in what we're dealing with, especially if we think we've got resistance in the pyrethroids, some regulatory concerns for the group 1s, the organophosphates, and there's a lot of regulatory talk about the neonicotinoids as well. So if we start losing any 1 or 2 of these groups, I think the hands of the farmers are really going to be tied when it comes to trying to manage soybean aphid. Thinking about insecticide rotations, so let's first think about a scenario where we planted seed, soybean seed, with no neonic seed treatment. And in this case, we're assuming the aphid populations probably have resistance to the pyrethroid insecticides. We're not going to be looking at using the pyrethroids for our first insecticide application, foliar application. So this first column would be, you know, what options do we have for that first foliar insecticide option? And then if we need to come back in and treat that field again, if we had a failure or recolonization by the soybean aphids, what options could there be? So if we come in with a group 1 insecticide, you know, something like chlorpyrifos or methomyl, we can see the options that could be available. Maybe a pyrethroid neonicotinoid mixture. So that could be something like indigo, or something like sulfoxaflor, which would be like Transform, Savanto, or Safina here, the 9D. Or we could, you know, potentially come in with a mixture, including a 3A insecticide, thinking about resistance management. If that's our goal, this probably isn't the best approach. If our aphids, we think they already have resistance and we're coming in with more exposure to that same group of insecticide. But most of our data is still suggesting that these mixtures containing the pyrethroids are still effective against the soybean aphid. However, I've got some data from the last 2 years that shows that one of those mixtures, the control it's offering, might be slipping a little bit. But if we were to come in with a mixture, we see suddenly that our options available for that retreatment are reduced by quite a bit, because we went in with 2 insecticide groups off the bat, so there's fewer remaining for that second option or second treatment. We've got the other group 4 insecticides, Transform, Savanto. We can see what options are available there, or the newer product Safina. We can see there's a pretty big suite of options there. But getting back to the seed treatment issue, so what I'm showing here is if we assume we did not plant neonic treated seed, if we did go in with neonic treated seed, and if our goal is insecticide resistance management, you see that we quickly lose some of those options in the middle of the table there, because we already had one application of that group 4 insecticide to that field. When it was planted, it had that neonic seed treatment in it, taken up by the plant. So aphids coming into that field early on will have been exposed to that insecticide. And remember, aphids reproduce clonally. So even though it might not be that same individual aphid, it's that same genetic stock that could be occurring later in the season. So that genetic stock, so to speak, those clones, could be exposed multiple times to that same insecticide group, which is not a good scenario for resistance management. So hopefully that kind of addresses the 2 aspects of that question.
That's right on, and we'll summarize that and post it with the webinar when we put that up. Do we want to jump back to Seth and talk planting date and compare the seed treatment to?
Yeah, so I had a huge bloody nose here. I guess it's that season now, dry weather. After 2 days in the airplane, maybe that didn't help. So The question about planting date's important. I think if you isolate the fungicide from the insecticide piece, is important to think about that. And Bob's points are really good regarding timing. In an IPM approach, I think with very late planting, we should see theoretically we should see a greater chance of return on investment because we have a more likely earlier infestation with aphids by growth phase, if you will. So because we're planting later, those aphids are going to come in when the soybeans are smaller, and the window of overlap between your insecticide seed treatment activity is going to overlap a little bit further into aphid flight. So with late planting, and I would say that has to be beyond June 1st for sure. I think then you might have a chance to get a little bit better return, or be able to delay some of those sprays later. On the fungicide alone side, I think that's where the planting date thing comes into play. It's a real give and take. We didn't see much in our data from any of our studies that really shows anything, and I think it's observationally we see the same thing in Minnesota. When we plant very, very early and use a seed treatment, it seems to us that we might be outliving the active ingredient, because it takes 3 or plus weeks for those soybeans to come out of the ground. And then sometimes, or most times, we don't see a yield response to that fungicide seed treatment with very early planting. Likewise, the same thing happens with very late planting. The soybeans pop out of the ground, and we don't have a lot of benefit for that seed treatment when they pop right out. So there's probably a sweet spot in the middle. But from a practical aspect, I guess I would recommend, if you're going to use a fungicide seed treatment, to focus it on the earliest planting. So, maybe treat some portion of your soybean seeds.
Okay, and I want to jump back to the chat box. I had one question come in there. So this is about non-neonic seed treatments, and historically, Bob, there have been some non-neonic seed treatments. But the question is if we're seeing any developments in that area that you're aware of coming down the pipeline as far as the use of non-neonic seed treatments in soybeans.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some, but in all honesty, I'm not very familiar with it. I haven't been involved in any testing of them or anything, and I haven't seen much in the literature.
Okay, so that's good. And then we had another question here, and it has to do with other practices. Are there practices other than non-use to reduce environmental impacts of neonates? Are seed treatments less likely to get into surface water than foliar use, or can you mention anything regarding that?
Sure. So I think, with the concern about environmental impacts of the neonates, we got to be thinking about those two different application methods, right? The seed application or the foliar applications, and what kind of environmental impact we're concerned about. In the question, they're talking about surface water contaminations. I think there's definitely risk with foliar applications of neonics, just as there are for chlorpyrifos and some of the other foliar applied insecticides. If we're getting drift situations like that, or spray over a stream or creek or something, when we're thinking about, but I think there's also risk from the seed treatments of those neonics applied to the seed getting into surface waters as well. There's data showing that when those seed treatments are made to the seed, and then the plant starts germinating, the seed starts germinating, plant starts growing, only a small fraction of that insecticide that was applied to the seed actually gets into the plant. The remainder is staying in the soil, and it's highly water soluble, like I mentioned before. So there is risk that could be moving it in the soil and, to surface waters or groundwaters potentially. And there's some data from the Minnesota Department of Agriculture that's showing that these insecticides are getting picked up, detected by this monitoring network in the surface waters.
Yeah, and we don't have a plan for a webinar on that topic right now, but maybe in the future we'll look at addressing some of these, water quality concerns and things, and giving people a better background on some of that information. So I think that's as far as we want to take that today. More focused on management for the time being. There's a question here about seed treatments in corn. I'm gonna dismiss that one. I'll reach out to Ken. We'll try to write up a little synopsis on that. I know there's not been the study like Seth was talking about in corn, at least not to my knowledge. So we're gonna skip past that. There's also a question here on soybean gall midge. We do have a new and emerging pest webinar coming up, and I think what we'll do is probably save that question and try to address it during that webinar series.
February 13th.
February 13th, so it's one of our February webinars. I'll save the question. We'll get that on there. So with that, then let's see here. We've got one question here. Based on most of the data I've seen, the majority of the research the academic world has presented over the years, neonics don't appear to be giving much yield advantage. So the ultimate question is, other than soil insects, wireworms, grubs, etc., where exactly do neonics have a fit in IPM? For soybean aphids, especially, if at all, and I think, Bob, you've hit that a couple times now today, that the timing just doesn't seem right for relying on that particular pest, particularly with normally planted soybeans. And I think earlier you said, there are certain circumstances where we've got a really late planted soybean following cannery peas. We do a fair amount of production of soybean or cannery peas, and I know a number of those acres do see soybeans following them, and that might be a fit for one of these. Anything else you can think of?
I think I mentioned earlier too, we've got some fields that just historically get colonized, infested by soybean aphids earlier. And if you've got some of those fields or one of those fields, maybe that would make sense for using a neonic seed treatment. I think, it's a situation where you'd be likely to have the aphids showing up when the insecticide concentrations are higher in the plant. But generally speaking, scouting and use of the threshold to determine when to apply foliar insecticides is a better management option for soybean aphid.
Okay, yeah, that sets that aside. Okay, we got a question here. Aside from eradicating buckthorn, which I wish we would pursue, is there any other treatment that might be viable of aphids on buckthorn? So that's just
yeah, right now we don't have any treatment options for the soybean aphid when they're on buckthorn. And I guess just so everyone's on the same page, the soybean aphids spend the summer on soybean, and then in the winter, this time of year, they're on buckthorn. So they live in buckthorn in the fall, they'll mate there, lay their eggs, and then in the spring, those eggs will hatch. They'll go through a few generations and then move to soybean. And unfortunately, we don't have any management options for soybean aphid when they're on buckthorn. However, we do know that some of the good insects, the predators and parasitic wasps that attack soybean aphid when it's in soybean fields, also move to these wooded areas to buckthorn in the fall and spring, and will feed on soybean aphids there. So we're getting some natural control.
So it sounds like if anyone's thinking of making some kind of application to buckthorn, that just was not, other than eradicating the alternate host, there's not really a management opportunity there.
None that I know of.
Okay.
There'd be too many other collateral effects of spraying these wooded areas with insecticide. You just try to get any benefit on soybean aphid. Remember, soybean aphid is very mobile. If you were to spray all your wooded areas with an insecticide, kill off the aphids on your farm, they're so mobile, they would likely just come in from the neighboring farm or the neighboring township. I don't think you would get a benefit from that.
Okay.
I'd like to go back to another question on the corn side. I think just make the obvious statement that corn is a very different crop. And the economics are completely different than soybean in that it's, it's a very high value crop on a per seed basis. We plant very low populations. corn is highly dependent on, the yield response is hugely dependent on population. Therefore, all that leads us to think that, we need to do whatever we can to protect every individual seed in corn. And so the economics really push towards utilizing these multiple modes of action for both fungus and for insects. I would flip that response though on its head and say, from an IPM standpoint and from a resistance management standpoint, thinking about the way we manage all of our crops, to remember that if corn is really dependent on these same sets of chemistries, that maybe that's another reason that we should be more careful with how we treat our alternate crops. If corn is hugely dependent on the same set of chemistries, and soybean, maybe it doesn't do much for us. Maybe that's another reason in and of itself to protect those technologies and not utilize those in soybeans, so that we have them there for corn in the future.
If I can just add on, I think it was kind of implied in what you were saying, Seth, but just to lay it out there, I mean, soybean is a much more forgiving crop if you get stand loss.
Right.
If a soybean plant loses its neighbors, it can get bushier and compensate for that, right? So soybean is more forgiving for stand loss, maybe from early season pests, than corn, where you get a much more direct or linear relationship with stand to yield, right?
Yes, for sure, exactly.
Okay, there's a question here about white mold control, and we'll post some links in on that. I don't think we really wanted to talk about that today. Seth, did you want to mention anything with soybean populations? Do you want to go down that road, or?
I don't think we need to open up that can right now. I think it's something that we can certainly talk about. There's a lot going on. I guess the overview, the summation of all my work is that there's a big range in populations that farmers can plant, and so farmers can be very conservative and plant 125 or less, or 185,000, and generally we get a pretty flat economic response curve from a really wide range of seeding rates. So farmers can be more liberal with their seeding rates and have the potential of getting a bushel or two back at the end of the year from these large studies. And it looks like all that does is it maximizes, in my view, return or yields on every acre within a field. So high seeding rates basically ensure that every acre has enough seed, and then that tends to pay off for us, in a pretty flat way. So again, my recommendations for seeding rates are that farmers really can't go wrong. They can either play it on the conservative side or be fairly liberal with those, and the economics are pretty flat.
Okay, well, that's good. I did see that Phyllis did post a link to the evaluation survey here. It's in the chat box. We'd really encourage you to let us know what you think, particularly with the kind of how the logistics of all the webinar works out, how you're liking that or disliking it, what things we could do better. We'd really appreciate it if you took some time today to fill in that evaluation for us. It's extraordinarily helpful and kind of helping us develop these things moving to the future. And with that, we're right about an hour, and we're kind of wrapped up on questions here. We had one late one pop up, and it's back to eradicating buckthorn. The fact that aphids are highly mobile, and we understand that, but is there anything we can say about eradicating buckthorn?
Yeah, so I think the obvious is, right, a lot of government agencies have been trying to get rid of buckthorn for a long time, and there's still a lot of buckthorn out there, so that's going to be a really tough goal to try to achieve. However, we do have a study going now that's, I think, in its third year, funded by the Minnesota Soybean Grower Association, and Dr. Marcella Windmuller from the Forestry Department is leading that up. And our goal there is to look to see if there's a relationship between buckthorn densities near soybean fields and soybean aphid densities in those fields. And then her specialty is managing trees and forested areas, silviculture. So then if we can show that there is a relationship, then the next step, if we can get the funding for it, would be to see if we can manipulate the buckthorn in those wooded areas and see if it results in any changes in the abundance in the field. So I don't know that we'd be able to eradicate soybean aphid, but my gut feeling is that it's probably not going to have much of an impact, but we don't have data to show that. So I'm going to keep an open mind, and we'll see what the research shows us.
Okay, more information forthcoming on that. And with that, I guess we're going to say thanks to everyone for participating today. Thanks for our speakers here in the room, Phyllis. And with that, we're wrapping. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.